The storm had started around dusk, creeping in with heavy clouds that swallowed the sky. By nightfall, the wind was screaming against the windows, and the rain fell in relentless sheets, as if the world outside was drowning. The occasional flash of lightning bathed the house in white, and thunder rolled through the empty rooms like distant drums. I was alone. That wasn't unusual. I often enjoyed these solitary nights. There was something calming about the rain, the quiet that came with it. The house had always been my refuge, but tonight the calm felt brittle, like it could shatter at any moment. I sat in the living room, an open book resting on my lap, unread. My eyes kept flickering to the windows, half expecting to see something peering in from the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that the storm wasn't the only thing pressing against the walls of the house. The first knock came so quietly I almost missed it. I lifted my head, staring toward the front door. The rain had muffled the sound, but I was sure of what I'd heard. I stayed frozen for a moment, listening. Nothing. Maybe it was just the storm, a branch or debris caught in the wind. But then it came again. Slow and deliberate, someone was at the door. I hesitated. Who could be out there in this weather? No one had called or texted. The hour was late, the storm unforgiving. Whoever it was couldn't mean well. I stood, my legs feeling strangely weak as I walked down the hallway toward the door. The lights flickered as I reached it, casting long, jittery shadows across the walls. I stopped just before the door, listening again, hoping to hear some kind of explanation. A voice? Footsteps? But there was nothing. Just the pounding of the rain and the whispering wind. Through the peephole, I could see nothing but darkness. No movement, no silhouette. I took a breath, opened the door just a crack, and peeked out. The porch was empty. I frowned, stepping back to open the door wider, scanning the yard. The storm continued to rage, trees bending in the wind, puddles forming in the driveway, but no one was there. No tracks, no sign of anyone having been there at all. I closed the door with a sigh, locking it. Just the wind, I told myself. The house creaked around me, as if trying to agree. I had barely taken 3 steps back toward the living room when I heard it again. I froze. The sound was louder this time, insistent, but I had just looked. There was no one there. My mind raced, trying to rationalize. Could someone have circled around, hiding, waiting for me to come back? A pit of unease settled in my stomach, but I couldn't ignore the knock. I turned slowly and approached the door again. My heart thudded in my chest as I reached for the knob. This time, I opened it fully. Nothing. No one. I stepped out onto the porch, letting the rain hit my face as I scanned the empty yard. Lightning lit up the sky for a split second, and in that flash, I thought I saw something. Movement. Just at the edge of the trees. A shape, dark and still, standing just beyond the reach of the porch light. I blinked. The figure was gone. Or maybe it had never been there at all. Feeling foolish, I stepped back inside, shaking my head. Get it together, I muttered, locking the door once more. I turned away, shutting my eyes for a moment to calm myself. But then, from right behind me, my breath caught in my throat. The knock hadn't come from the front door, it had come from inside the house. I spun around, my eyes darting across the room. The hallway stretched before me, shadows pooling in the corners. The storm raged outside, but the air inside felt thick and heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. I moved toward the sound, each step slower than the last, heart pounding in my ears. I reached the living room, but nothing was out of place. The back door leading to the yard sat just beyond the kitchen, barely visible from where I stood. Suddenly, the knock came again. This time it came from the back door. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself forward. I approached the door slowly, every instinct screaming at me to turn around, to pretend I hadn't heard anything, but I had to see. I unlocked the back door and yanked it open. The rain was pouring harder than ever, the night a solid wall of darkness, but through the sheets of rain, just beyond the porch, a figure stood. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs too long, its head tilted in an almost curious way. The storm seemed to have twisted around it, the wind moving with it, as though it carried the storm itself. Before I could react, it moved closer, impossibly fast. The air grew colder, my breath coming out in shallow gasps. The figure stepped up to the porch, towering over me, its face hidden in shadow. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I backed away, my eyes never leaving the door. But then, from the other side of the door, I heard it again. And a voice, cold and hollow, whispered from the other side, "Let me in." It had only been a week since I moved into my new apartment. The quiet was nice. It was the kind of silence that comes with being alone for the first time. No parents, no siblings, just me in this run-down, half-forgotten building. The place wasn't much, but it was mine. I felt free for the first time in my life, like I had finally left behind all the noise of home. That night, I was unpacking my last box, a tangle of clothes and kitchen items, trying to make sense of the mess, when I heard a knock. It was loud, sharp enough to cut through the silence and make me jump. I froze, staring at the door. My hand still gripped a stack of plates, now slightly trembling. It was late, nearly 11 p.m. No one had visited me all week. I hadn't even seen my neighbors. I set the plates down carefully, half expecting the knock to come again. When it didn't, I slowed down and stood and walked to the door. The hallway was quiet, maybe too quiet. I opened the door cautiously, peeking into the corridor. No one. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, casting a dull yellow hue on the faded walls. I stepped out, looking up and down the hallway, but there was nothing, just emptiness. I was about to close the door when I noticed something on the floor, a small piece of paper, crumpled and lying just outside my apartment. Frowning, I bent down and picked it up. As I unfolded it, I felt my heart quicken. 2 words, hastily scribbled in uneven handwriting, stared back at me. "Follow me." I stood there for a moment, frozen in place, staring at the note. My mind raced. Follow who? Was this some sort of prank? Some weird initiation from one of the neighbors? But why leave the note here, and why that message? Before I could make sense of it, I heard another knock. This time, it didn't come from my door. I whipped around, trying to locate the sound. It had come from it directly across the hall, from the apartment facing mine. My breath caught. The sound was so clear, so precise, but I hadn't heard anyone or open or close the door. How had they knocked without me noticing? Cautiously, I took a step toward the door across from mine, the one that had knocked. I lifted my hand to return the knock, but just as my knuckles were about to touch the wood, I froze. The sound had moved, echoing down the hallway. It wasn't coming from the apartment in front of me anymore. It was coming from farther down the hall, deeper into the building. I glanced down at the note in my hand. Follow me. It was as if the knock was beckoning me. I shouldn't have followed. Every instinct told me to close my door, lock it, and forget the whole thing. But something else, a mix of curiosity, fear, and a need to understand, pushed me forward. I walked slowly toward the next door, listening as the knock came again, a little louder this time. When I reached the door, I raised my hand to knock back, but just as my fingers grazed the wood, the sound jumped again, coming from another apartment farther down the hall. My pulse quickened as I continued. my footsteps hesitant but drawn by the strange game of hide and seek. Every time I reached a door, the knock would come from somewhere else. It was always just out of reach, luring me farther. Eventually, it looped down the hallway until I was at the door immediately adjacent to my own. My hands were shaking. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, my breath shallow. I didn't know why I kept going, why I let myself get this far, but now there was no turning back. My hand hovered over the door, ready to knock, but before I could, I froze, my blood running cold. The sound had yet again come from a different door, but this time it was from my door, from inside my apartment. I turned slowly, heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't left my door open, but I also hadn't locked it. My steps felt heavy. When I reached my door, I hesitated, standing just outside the threshold. I didn't want to go in. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to leave, but I couldn't. I opened the door. Inside, there was something on the floor, another note lying just inside my apartment. I bent down and picked it up. I unfolded the paper slowly, dreading what I might see. It read, "Welcome home." My stomach lurched. The air around me felt thick, suffocating. I stepped inside, looking around the room. Everything was as I had left it. The boxes, half unpacked, the stack of dishes on the counter. But there was something off. The air felt colder. A creeping sensation of being watched prickled at the back of my neck. I took a slow breath, trying to calm myself, when the door behind me slammed shut. I spun around, heart in my throat, but the door was closed, no sign of what could have done it. The room was silent, so silent I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I stood there for what felt like an eternity. I heard nothing. I saw nothing. Was it over? I took a deep breath, calmed down, chuckled a little, and turned around to keep unpacking my boxes. And then... Let me tell you about a case that has haunted me for nearly a decade. It's a series of disappearances that started with an ordinary family, the Smiths, living in a quiet suburb. One fateful night, their daughter Lily answered a knock at the door while her parents were just a few steps away in the living room. She never returned. The parents heard the knock, and before they could react, Lily had opened the door. When they finally went to check on her, the door was ajar, and all that remained was a single scuffed shoe left behind, a small black one worn at the edges. It was the only clue, and it tore through their lives like a jagged knife. This case was the first in a chilling pattern that would grip our city. As I dove into the investigation, I discovered that more families had been affected, each victim vanishing under eerily similar circumstances. Take Sarah, for example, a college student who disappeared during a study session with friends at her parents' home. They were all in the living room when the knock echoed through the hall. Sarah opened the door and simply walked out, leaving behind her friends, her books, and her future. Then there was Mark, a young father. One evening, he vanished while babysitting his daughter. They were watching cartoons, his little girl curled up beside him, and then there was that knock at the door. He stepped outside, chuckling at her silly antics, but never returned. The pattern was undeniable. Every disappearance occurred when the family was nearby, a moment of safety shattered by that knock. Every time, a loving family was left behind, torn apart by confusion and grief. I can't tell you how many parents have come to me over the years, desperate for answers, each one asking, "What happened to my child?" Each one pleading for me to find the truth. I can still remember the look in their eyes, the anguish, the heartache. They were all close-knit families filled with laughter and love, now fractured by the unknown. The pain of their loss weighed heavily on me as I pored over case files, searching for a connection. The mystery deepened. Despite countless interviews and exhaustive searches, I found no common thread among the victims beyond the timing of their disappearances. I did start to notice, though, that each case had one haunting detail. A single shoe left by the door. Always one. Always the left shoe. It felt like a cruel joke, a reminder of their loved ones who had left. Then one night, the unthinkable happened. My daughter, Emma, was having friends over for a sleepover. Laughter filled our home as the girls giggled in the living room, playing games and munching on snacks. I was in my study, lost in the case files, when I heard the knock at the door. I remember the moment vividly. I called out to Emma, but she was already standing up, curiosity lighting her eyes. "I'll get it, Dad," she said cheerfully, bouncing toward the door. I barely had time to react as she opened it. "Emma!" I shouted, but it was too late. She stepped outside, and just like that, she vanished. The laughter in the house turned to panic. I searched everywhere, but she was gone, leaving behind nothing but a single sneaker, now resting at the threshold. That was the breaking point for me. The case had transformed from a professional burden into a personal nightmare. I was determined to find Emma and uncover the truth. In the days that followed, I threw myself into the investigation like never before. I named it The Caller. Yes, I said it. At this point, there's no indication as to what it is, as each disappearance seems impossible. I followed every lead, every rumor floating around the city. Stories of something that could draw people to the door, convincing them to open it, all while they felt an overwhelming sense of safety. What struck me most was the timing of these events. Each knock at the door came late at night, just when families were settling in, lulled into a false sense of security. It was as if the caller knew when to strike, targeting moments when people were most vulnerable. In my search for answers, I received an anonymous tip that sent me to an abandoned mine on the edge of town. As I sped to the mine, my instincts screamed that I was getting closer to the truth. I didn't have to go far inside the mine to find it. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay, and as I moved deeper into the darkness, I'll never forget what I saw. A collection of shoes, each one the exact match to those left at each scene. I felt my heart race as I examined them, desperately looking for Emma's, and then I found it. And then I cried. As I examined it, I noticed a small note embedded in the sole. It contained a cryptic string of characters scrawled in a black, flaky substance. I don't understand it. I don't know what it means, and I have to find out. They're not just disappearing, they are being taken. They were drawn to that door, to the knock, and something was waiting for them on the other side. For a while, it seemed as if the nightmare had ended. It's been a year now since someone was taken. The disappearances stopped in our town and families slowly began to heal. But I didn't. I never found Emma. Sometimes I dream of finding her, and then I wake up and continue living the nightmare that is my life. I continue my relentless pursuit of the caller. 2 days ago, I received an unsettling call from a police department in a different state, a small town where a pattern had emerged. It starts with a knock at the door, and just like before, a loving family member had stepped outside, never to return, leaving only a left shoe. They think it's connected to my cases. As I listened to the officer on the other end of the line, I could feel the familiar chill run down my spine, full of hope and dread. I acted quickly. I gathered my notes, and now I'm headed to the new town, determined to prevent this cycle from continuing and to find my daughter. Finally, the caller has returned. I'm about to dive back into the darkness and end this